What's up everybody, welcome to Moto. Today we're going to talk about the fork geometry and how to properly set it up. Alright, so we're going to use the old bike since it's all stripped down to illustrate what should and shouldn't be done and what should be considered. A couple of things to talk about. One is rake and the effects that has. Also the length of the forks, the travel that the forks have, as well as the trail, which is another very important feature. And the effects it has on the handling of the motorcycle. Alright, so the first thing we're going to talk about is rake. The rake is essentially a measure of an angle going between the head of the fork and the vertical line. So using our trusty protractor here, we can measure that, and it's coming up to be right around 28.9. Now this bike is not exactly leveled right now, but let's assume that is indeed what the measure is, 28.9. When I previously measured it, I measured it like 27.5 or 27.8 or something like that. So what the rake really means is it's the angle. Let's use this stick to kind of illustrate. It's this angle here, right? And what that really means is how inclined the fork is. Now, the angle being closer to 45 degrees and larger makes this push out this way, making the front wheel go further, extending the wheelbase of the motorcycle, and creating higher speed stability. Now, on sports bikes, you probably notice that their forks are probably more upright. That in turn creates a lack of high-speed stability, but also presents a low-speed maneuverability. So the bikes feel more responsive, they're easier to steer, and so on. So that's really what rake is all about. The other kind of important feature here to talk about is the fork length and fork travel. So the fork length is considered the measure from the top yoke, so the top of the top yoke, to the mounting bolt at the bottom. Now, on this bike, I forgot what the measure turned out to be, but I shortened that essentially by 2 inches. So by doing so, I have also affected the other characteristic of the fork, which is the travel. Now, the travel of the fork is the distance or the delta in change of the length of the fork from its natural standing state, which is as is right now, to its compressed state, which is under load, right? Now, with this one, because I shortened it 2 inches, the stock bike is supposed to have about 5.5 inches of travel. Now, since I shortened it 2 inches, that 2 inches was automatically removed from the travel that the fork has, which left it with about 3.5 to 3 inches. Now, 3 to 3.5 inches technically doesn't sound too bad until you add in the other factors. So right now this bike is obviously pretty stripped down, there's no fuel in it, and there's no person standing on it. When you add that in, you need to accommodate for another inch and a half of load and slack on the forks. So now those 3.5 inches leaves about an inch and a half, maybe 2 inches of. Essentially what I've done by shortening these by 2 inches is I've turned this bike from a sports touring motorcycle into a hard front motorcycle, which of course would make it very dangerous to ride. Now, The other aspect that I want to talk about is trail. Trail is a very interesting characteristic of front end suspension on motorcycles. The reason for that is that it can really make or break the handling of a motorcycle. So by shortening the forks the way I have done, what has happened essentially is the entire assembly has moved up, which meant that the wheel was brought further in this way. Essentially the wheelbase was shortened, which in turn changed the trail. Now, trail is a measure between the vertical line of the mounting of the fork and the wheel, so the axle essentially. So it's a vertical line drop down to the bottom. So let's say we're going to use this for now. Let's say that this is where that is, so right where the blue mark is, and that position compared with a straight line drawn through the fork head down to the floor, and this distance that you see right here is your trail. So what that distance means is that, again, handling is affected quite drastically. There is a safe zone that trail needs to be in. So most modern motorcycles will put trail in between 3.5 to 6 inches of trail. Now, with all the changes that I've done to this front end, let's say we ignored the amount of travel and the bike was actually able to have more travel in there. The trail I computed was essentially reduced to just under 4 inches, which essentially made it into a bike that, should the suspension be able to handle that, will actually handle pretty well. So most of your sports touring old motorcycles that are with pretty decent performance usually have that sort of trail. So by shortening that distance, we would have made this bike slightly shorter and handle slightly better. But because I cut the springs, that made it slightly shorter, handle or feel like it would handle slightly better, but highly unsafe with the amount of travel that the front has. So note to self, if you're ever going to shorten your forks, don't do 2 inches. Do something less and do the math such that you are left with enough travel to be safe to ride the motorcycle. Otherwise, you're going to end up with something like this that essentially isn't safe. And the only way to kind of use this configuration is to get springs that are this short but are much stronger to compensate for the lack of travel. Now what that would end up doing is it will probably give you a little bit more travel like you should have, but it will make the front end stiffer, so the front will just bounce around everywhere instead of just completely compressing and having no travel. So either way, not a really good idea. What we'll probably end up doing with the other bike is essentially what was done to this one when I got it, and that is slide the forks up such that we can set up the front end to have that a bit nicer handling and better stance, and use things that way. Alright guys, so I took off the front fairing and the saddlebacks at the back, and we're ready to drop the forks. So I did some measurements before I start changing anything. Currently this bike actually has a bigger front tire. It's a 120 90/18, where on the other one it's a 110, so that's good. We can actually, now I know that 120s will actually fit on it, which actually changes the diameter slightly. Also, I measured the rake on it just so we have a consistency here to compare. In its current position, the rake is at 31.6 degrees. I also measured the clamp offset, so that's the distance from this center point right here to the center point of the forks. So this little bit here, that comes up to be 2.375 inches. And I also measured the fork length. So the fork length is right now 32 and 11/16. So that's from this point here down to the point right here. So I'll do the math and I'll tell you guys the current trail of the bike, and I'm gonna start lowering it and see what we get then. Alright guys, so I did the math, and currently bike in its stock condition, we can compute that it has a 5.36 inches of trail. Now, based on the documentation for the bike, it says 5.5. My driveway here is not perfectly leveled, so yeah, that's roughly about what I'm getting here. So now I'm going to start lowering it and start computing that trail to know where is the safe spot to set things up on. Alright, so I pulled the forks up through the triple trees about 1.5 inches. As you can see, they are currently this much higher. Measured out everything, and the numbers we're getting now are, instead of 31.6 degrees of rake, now we're down to 29.6, so roughly 2 degrees change. The other thing that we changed was, because the forks slid up, the fork length has now changed from 32 inches and 11/16 to 30 inches and 3/4. So all that really pretty much translates down to our trail changing from 5.36 inches down to 4.8 inches. So we're getting a roughly 1/2 inch of trail difference. Now 4.8 is pretty decent. This bike is quite long, and I think, just aesthetically speaking, once these forks are, these handlebars are taken off and I put clip-ons, this distance at the top that sticks out is probably fine like this. I wouldn't want it to stick out any further. So I think this is kind of the final stance of the bike. One thing I might try before I end up buying clip-ons is I might try to move these guys from here to down here, so that the actual handlebar would end up right about where clip-on would be, just to kind of get a better look at what the bike will look like with the handlebars lower and kind of feel for the stance. Alright guys, so that was it for this episode. I hope it was educational as much for you as it was for me. Make sure to check out balkamoto.com, where I'll have an article with more diagrams and explanations on how the front suspension characteristics are affected by the length and travel and rake of the forks. So make sure to subscribe, click the little bell to get notifications when new videos become available, and also check me out on Instagram at balkamoto2018. So thanks for watching, and see you next time.